Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, my friend Celcio. Thank you all for coming, some old friends and some new faces. It's not only a pleasure, but a privilege to speak in President Cardoso's place. As Mr. Laffer has just mentioned, I completed a biography of Yitzhak Rabin recently. And writing a leader's biography is a good opportunity to find out for yourself the importance of the leader and the personality in history. That there are always debates between biographers and historians, because the historians like to look at great forces at work and the biographers focus on personalities, but the truth is that the historical processes and forces at work end up being channeled through a prism. And the prism is the prism of the leadership of individual leaders. And I think Brazil was lucky at the time to have a personality like President Cardoso leading it. The world was fortunate to have Brazil led by him, and it's a pleasure that you remain through the elders and in other fora involved in world affairs, trying to make it a better place. So I definitely feel privileged to be here. You know, Celso Laffer mentioned that I was both a university president and an ambassador, a diplomat engaged in, to some extent, if not in politics, then in policy. And therefore, I'm in a unique position to appreciate the relationship between university presidency and the real world. There are many stories about that relationship. One of them has to do with President Woodrow Wilson, who before becoming the President of the United States was the President of Princeton University. And someone asked him, what made you leave the placid greens of Princeton to come to Washington? And his answer was, I was tired of the politics. So that is probably the last laughter we are going to hear today, because the story I'm going to deal with is not a happy story, as we know. The Middle East is not a happy place nowadays. Has not been for a few years. In a way, it has not been a happy place for a long time, because if we look at the history of the Middle East, after World War I, actually, after the breakup of the three great multinational empires, the Russian, the Habsburg, and the Ottoman Empire, everybody at the time thought that these were antiquated entities, and it was time for nation states and national movements to carry the day. But if you look today at Eastern Europe, at Central Europe, and in the Middle East, the thought comes to mind that maybe it was not such a good idea to break up these multinational entities and to replace them with states that certainly in the Middle East are now collapsing one after the other. So what I'd like to do is look at some of the major changes that have affected the Middle East in the past few years, and then look at them specifically from an Israeli perspective, as a country that lives in the Middle East and whose national security, diplomatic position, and in many ways way of life are affected by its relationship with the region and with whatever is happening in the region. So one is, if we look at the relationship between the region and the world. The Middle East has been dominated for many years from the outside. Actually, look at the very term Middle East. Unlike Latin America, which is one thing, or South America, which is an absolute geographic term, what is the Middle East? It's the part of the East that is on the middle of the way between Western Europe and the Far East. In other ways, even the name of the region has been determined from an outside, from an external perspective. And of course, with the beginning of modern period, the late 18th century, early 19th century, the region had been dominated by the colonial power, first and foremost Britain and France, was the scene of rivalry between other powers. And since 1945, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the scene of one of the most important arenas of the Cold War. The Middle East, obviously, been until recently the source of much of oil and energy in the world. It sits astride very important routes, both naval and aerial. And as Soviet communiques about the region used to say, Moscow cannot remain insensitive to events that happen so close to our southern borders. Well, it's true. So until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was the scene of a very intense rivalry. And in a way, similarly to what I said about the disappearance of the multinational empires, when the Cold War ended in the Middle East, there was someone who said, we may yet long for the Cold War, because the Cold War had its problems, but there was order and a pattern. There were two superpowers. By and large, the states in the Middle East belonged to one or the other camps, and it gave a certain order and stability to things in the Middle East. With the removal of the end of the Cold War, there began a period of quest for an order. For a short time after the first Gulf War, when the United States intervened militarily at the head of international coalition to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and to remove the threat to Saudi Arabia, American prestige was at a very high point. It was the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed. There was only one superpower. That superpower demonstrated that it was willing to act on behalf of its allies or clients in the Middle East, and it also began what is known as the Madrid process, that is to say, the most serious effort to date to try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there were 12 years of the heyday of American influence and hegemony in the Middle East that ended with the unfortunate invasion of Iraq in 2003. That was an ill-conceived and ill-performed invasion that ended up in destroying the Iraqi state, in opening the floodgates, because Iraq was the gateway through which Iran could not move into the core area of the Middle East. With the removal of Saddam Hussein and his regime, Iran began its quest for its own hegemony in the region, establishing itself in Syria, in Lebanon, and in other places. The United States, as the term coined in Washington is, went through a pivot. That's shifting its interest from very high involvement in the Middle East to greater interest and involvement in the Pacific area. And one can understand that. I mean, with the growth of China, with the prospect of maybe a more aggressive China, with the construction of these artificial islands and extension of the Chinese naval influence in the region, with the growing tensions there, one can understand why the United States today is more interested in the Pacific and maybe less interested in the Middle East. The second element here is the fatigue in the United States. Our age is called a post-heroic age. Let's say countries are not willing to send their young men to die in foreign battlefields for political diplomatic ends. That our societies don't tolerate that anymore. It happened earlier in Europe, it happened later in the United States, but after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there definitely is a mood in the United States reflected very clearly through President Obama, that we don't want to become entangled in another Middle Eastern war. And of course, the most prominent manifestation of that mood was the decision that even though what the president himself defined as a red line and a game changer, that is to say the use of chemical weapons by President Assad of Syria against his own population, was crossed, President Obama decided not to act. This was a very clear signal to friend and foe alike that the United States was not interested in having what the term is boots on the ground in the Middle East. And that, of course, is a very important signal. So the United States is not completely out, but its presence and influence in the region have diminished. And since vacuums don't really exist in geopolitics, there's been an effort to fill that vacuum by Putin and Moscow. You see a much more aggressive, ambitious policy in the Middle East, most primarily manifested recently in the intervention in Syria. But President Putin is discovering what US presidents discovered earlier and others discovered earlier, that there are no easy trips in the Middle East. What began as a show-off of Russian military might, bombing from the air, launching cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea, shown many, many times on Russian television as a manifestation of our military might, has produced very, very few results on the ground, and may have produced the revenge of the terrorist organization Islamic State. That is to say, the destruction of the Soviet passenger airliner over the sky of the Sinai Peninsula. So these are the perils of trying to take on groups like the Islamic State. So we are in a very unclear situation in the Middle East, and American reluctance to become involved, a Soviet period or a Russian period of finding out how complex it is, and there is a more general, a sort of a vague sense that it may be hopeless. And if you measure investment versus results, there's very little to show for. The American invasion of Iraq destroyed the state of Iraq, and in a way, the appearance of the organization known as Islamic State is an indirect result of the destruction of the state. Because if we look at this organization, ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State, we actually see two different entities. We see people on the ground who control now a large part of western Iraq and a large part of eastern Syria. There is no border now between Iraq and Syria, and in many respects it's a state. It has a capital in one of the Syrian cities. It has a legal system, if you want to use that term in a very liberal way. It has an economy, actually some surprising ways of earning money through selling oil, antiquities, abducting people for ransom, but it produces revenue, and it's a relatively rich organization. It's a byproduct of the American invasion of Iraq. And what was the byproduct of toppling Muammar Gaddafi in Libya? A total state of anarchy, and the removal of the barrier of African immigration to Europe. Because Muammar Gaddafi, I'm not going to say anything positive about Muammar Gaddafi, but from a West European point of view, he kept the lead on the vessel. It did not allow him, African from Equatorial Africa, to cross at a convenient point to Europe. And now we are seeing mostly Middle Eastern and Syrian immigrants to Europe, but the real wave that is waiting to arrive in Europe is a wave from Africa and not from the Middle East, an unintended consequence of the removal of Muammar Gaddafi. So a very complex equation between the international system and the Middle East. And the second very important development is decline in importance of the Middle East, also because of the decline of importance of Middle Eastern oil. A few years ago, we would have begun perhaps by talking about Middle Eastern oil, the largest depository of proven repository of of oil in places like Saudi Arabia, Iran. Of course, huge revenues from oil that gave countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Libya and Qatar a great deal of influence in the region and internationally. That is changing with the discovery of other sources of energy, the growing importance of gas, and the dramatic decline in the price of oil. Countries that, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, that have had these enormous incomes, revenues from oil, are now having less and less. And if this continues over time, they may discover that money is an object. So, but for the world, of course, the importance of the geopolitical importance of the Middle East is different. I remember that at the time when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, one of President Bush's aides wrote the first memorandum to the president, and it began with the words, "Mr. President, it is about oil." Today, this sentence would not have been written. Thirdly, a change in balance in the Middle East between its Arab component and non-Arab components. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when people spoke about the Middle East, they spoke about it almost interchangeably with the term Arab world. This is no longer the case. Two non-Arab states have joined the Middle Eastern system, Turkey and Iran. Now, it may sound a bit surprising. After all, they've always been there. And after all, for many years, the empires that ruled the Middle East until the beginning of the New Age in the late 18th century were either Turkish or Persian. The Ottoman Empire, 1517 to 1917, and a variety of Persian dynasties were in control of much of the Middle East. So why did they have to rejoin the Middle East? The answer is that because for much of the 20th century, they were not part of the Middle Eastern political system or political diplomatic system. Turkey, under the impact of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, saw itself as a secular modern republic, looking westward, not eastward, wanting to secularize, to modernize, to be part of Europe. And of course, two things happened. One is they were rebuffed by Europe because the European Union, simply put, does not want another 80 million Muslims in Europe. And partly as a result of that, but partly as a result of other developments, Turkey now has, in effect, an Islamist government. Mr. Erdogan was not the first to be elected as an Islamist in Turkey. There was a Mr. Erbakan, but Mr. Erbakan was not a good politician. He tried too soon to Islamize the country. The military acted. He was thrown out of power. Erdogan proved to be much more ambitious, much more effective politically. He had patience and very gradually eliminated centers of power, the leadership of the army, the judiciary, the press, over time. And as we saw just about a week ago, he was able to win yet another election, not quite able to Putinize himself, but getting closer. And of course, since Turkey cannot join Europe, and it's a country with a strong economy, one of the G20, great ambitions, its natural sphere is the former Ottoman Empire in the Middle East itself, in the tip of the Balkans, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. It's a country with an unusual geopolitical position, but it's back in the Middle East. And for a short while, Erdogan had dreams of becoming actually the leader for the region. He was hoping that the Arab world would rally behind him. He discovered that it was not so easy, and actually his efforts to intervene in Syria and to interfere with Egyptian politics and other efforts all produced negative results. If you may recall, he's the man who is now the prime minister and was his foreign minister, Davutoglu, defined Turkish policy, said, as a policy of zero conflicts. And somebody said cynically, you should put a digit before the zero, because Erdogan and Davutoglu ended up having several conflicts with neighboring states. Iran is a different case. Iran, under the two Shahs of the Pahlavi dynasty during much of the 20th century, was busy, preoccupied with domestic issues because it was trying to modernize, and was busy defending itself against Soviet expansionism and aggression. It had no resources to invest in our part of the Middle East. But with the Islamic Revolution of 1979, they began a policy of trying to export the revolution and to, after 2003, after the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, to actually become hegemonial in the region. You know, it's one of the rules of history that great revolutions tend to export themselves. And the Iranian Revolution of '79 was a great revolution. So the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Iranian Revolution all had a policy of trying to export the revolution. The natural markets for Iranian export are the Shia communities of the Middle East. I'd say for those of you who are not Middle East experts, I would say that Islam broadly divided into Sunni Islam, which is the majority, and Shia Islam, which is the minority. And Iran is a Shia country. There was a Shia Arab majority in Iraq, but the elite for many years was Sunni. There's Shia communities in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, and these are the arenas into which the Iranian Revolution has tried to export itself. The greatest success has been in Lebanon, where through a movement called Hezbollah, Iran was able actually to control the politics of Lebanon. Lebanon is a country in which an organization called Hezbollah is stronger than the government and stronger than the army. So that is the great success of Iran. Of course, the gateway to Lebanon for Iran is Syria, and hence the great interest that Iran has in Syria and in the survival of the current regime in Syria. But now let's look at the overall outcome. That's a different Middle East. Suddenly includes these two additional countries. They are not just two countries. Both of them have about 80 million people. Both of them have large economies. Both of them have civil societies. Both have sophisticated elites, good science, academic communities, and strong armies. So 160 million people joined the Middle East in that regard, represented by powerful states, and that has made a big difference. Now, the third strong country in the Middle East is Israel. So you now have a Middle Eastern system in which the three major actors are not Arab: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Add to this the fact that the Arab world is in a period of crisis. I mentioned Syria, I mentioned Libya, but let's for a moment look at the overall pictures. We see failed states. Syria is a failed state, Iraq is a failed state, Libya is a failed state, Yemen is a failed state. And where we don't have a failed state, we have states preoccupied with very serious domestic problems. There's no need to elaborate on the kind of problem that Egypt is now facing, because the destruction of the Russian airplane is just one manifestation of the strength of terrorist undergrounds in Egypt, and President Sisi has to deal with the massive domestic problems. Look at the curious, ironic fact that for a long time Egypt tried to deny that this was a terrorist act. There were two countries that were trying to deny it for a week: Egypt and Russia. Egypt doesn't want to admit that it has a huge terrorist problem that it cannot control, and Russia didn't want to admit that its policy in Syria led to the explosion of or destruction of its airplane. It was the Russian airline company that was the first to announce that it was terrorist, because it wanted to demonstrate that it was not a case of negligence. So they were the first to say that it was terrorism. Now it's common knowledge that it was a terrorist it was a terrorist act and a manifestation of the problem that Egypt has. Saudi Arabia, a very important Arab country, has huge domestic problems. It has a royal house with 5,000 princes. Not all of them love one another. And the current ruler is the last son of King Ibn Saud to be king. There will be a transition after him. He himself is not a teenager, and there may be struggles for succession. The Saudi system doesn't function very smoothly. So after the hopes that the Arab Spring of 2010, 2011 raised that a new dawn has come to the Arab world and democracy will replace dictatorship and autocracy, and finally the Arab world will come to its own, has been replaced by the grim realities of what people now call the Arab winter or the Arab turmoil. And the most significant of this counter development is Syria, a very tragic development, the total collapse of an important Arab state, a terrible human cost and tragedy, more than 200,000 people killed in the civil war. In a country of 22 million, almost 10 million are displaced. 6 million are displaced inside Syria, and 4 million are refugees in neighboring countries, in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And there's no end in sight, because Syria today is the equivalent of Spain 1936, 1939. It's the arena of a conflict between regional powers and the international actors. First and foremost, the competition between Iran, that is the big supporter of Assad, and Saudi Arabia, that is the major enemy of President Bashar al-Assad, and other regional actors like Qatar and Jordan and Turkey and so forth, and the international actors. The United States and Western Europe want Assad to go. They don't act on it for reasons that I mentioned before, but they are against him, and Russia is the big protector. For one thing, it has a naval base on the Mediterranean, on the Syrian shore, which it wants to keep. Secondly, the idea that Syria would somehow end up under American influence is unacceptable to Putin. There are also potential repercussions for Russia of the success of the Islamic State organization, because Russia itself has a large Muslim population. It has its Chechnya problem and other issues, and they are afraid of this organization. They think they would like to destroy it on the ground, but it's, as we saw, not such an easy task. And finally, Putin, who wants to restore Russia, maybe not to the full status of a superpower the way the Soviet Union was, but to a major international player, almost on a par with the United States, saw a golden opportunity, what I would call the low-hanging fruit. Say, since the United States is not so much in the game, maybe here's an opportunity for Putin to be the peacemaker, to try to find a political diplomatic solution to the civil war, except that it's proven to be very difficult. The opposition will not accept any solution with Assad staying in power. Assad and his minority group have no intention of leaving power. They are simply afraid that if he leaves power, there will be a bloodbath and a revenge of the majority against the minority. And so at this point, there seems to be no way out. So, of course, in terms of the region, if you look at the fact that a major state in the region does not exist, that its neighbor to the east, Iraq, is practically divided among three units, the Shia in control, the Sunnis under ISIS, and the Kurds in the north on the Turkish border having an autonomy bordering on independence. A word about the Kurds. I think that in the coming years we will hear more and more about the Kurds. The Kurds are a nation or people of about just over 20 million people, divided among 4 countries, let's say Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. In Iraq, they, as I said, have an autonomy. In Syria, on the Turkish border, they have a practical autonomy. Inside Turkey, is now the most important domestic problem is the renewed conflict between Erdogan and the radical Kurds. The Kurds are 20% of the Turkish population, and the Turks are afraid that if there is Kurdish independence in Iraq or in Iraq and Syria, the repercussions into Turkey would lead to almost a dissolution of the Turkish state. So the problem is not acute because the Kurds themselves are not in a hurry. They've had long experience that taught them that patience is a good quality sometimes in politics and diplomacy, but eventually it's going to be, I think, a more important issue on the agenda. Now let's look at some of these issues from an Israeli perspective. And what I've described from an Israeli, call it self-centered point of view, is some of them are positive, some of them are negative. If you look at the relationship between Israel and the Arab world as a relation of hostility and enmity, then of course it's a zero-sum game. If the other side is becoming weaker, then my relative position is stronger. But I think that's a simple-minded of looking at it. For one thing, we now have peace treaties with two Arab states, with Egypt and with Jordan, and we have semi-normal relations with several Arab states. I can travel to a number of other Arab countries on my Israeli passport, and Israel has practical relations with several Arab states. Two Arab states, Egypt and Jordan, were willing openly to buy gas from Israel. Jordan is very happy to buy desalinated water from Israel. These are all developments that not been there. All are byproducts of the Oslo Agreement, signed in 1993, that provided mutual recognition between Israel and the Palestinian National Movement, the PLO. Very controversial at the time, very controversial in Israel now, where a right-wing government is critical of the agreement, but we have to remember that it gave Israel the recognition of the Palestinians, and therefore other Arabs say we don't have to be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. If the Palestinians recognize Israel, we can also deal with Israel. So this idea of a simple zero-sum game, is what's bad for the Arabs is good for Israel, doesn't really apply. But there is no danger of a conventional war between Israel and the Arab world because there are no Arab armies. We have peace with Egypt, we have peace with Jordan. The Syrian army does not exist, the Iraqi army does not exist. So the danger of a conventional war, the types of war that we had in 48 and 56 and 67 and 73 and 82, that kind of war is off the map. On the map, unfortunately, is a different type of war that we call asymmetrical war. Most of the wars nowadays are asymmetrical. If we look at what is happening in Ukraine, this is not a conventional war. This is a sophisticated Russian strategy of fighting actually a guerrilla war by a very large state. But in most cases, what I call an asymmetrical war is a war between a country, a state, and a regular army, and an irregular militia or terrorist groups. So let's look at the typical. We have had several of these rounds. We had a war in Lebanon in 2006. We had several operations in Gaza since then. And what is happening is that Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza now all have rockets and missiles that they can fire into Israel. We have a very effective anti-ballistic missile system, but it's not good against Katyusha rockets. At this point, we don't have the response, and so let's say in 2006 there was quite a bit of devastation in Israel. How does a state that wants to abide by international law fight an organization that puts its rockets and missiles in schools, in mosques, in hospitals? You can locate them very precisely, but do you want to shoot back and become a war criminal? The laws that that were made in Geneva and other places to regulate warfare between countries are laws that were made at the time of conventional wars. Nowadays, they don't apply to the asymmetrical wars that, for us at least, are what we have to face. So here the challenge for Israel is dual. We have to retool the Israeli army and security forces in order to deal primarily with this kind of challenge, not with the challenge of air forces and armored corps. And we have to find the proper legal ways of trying to do it within the law, and also trying to persuade the international community that perhaps the laws should be changed in order to deal with this reality. So the transition from conventional war to an asymmetrical war is a major challenge for Israel. The Syrian civil war. Here is the paradox: of all the neighbors that Syria has, the country least affected by the Syrian civil war is Israel. Lebanon has 1 million refugees, and Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese organization, does most of the fighting inside Syria. Turkey has also about more than 1 million, which is refugees, which is now shipping to Greece and to Europe. Iraq and Syria, there is no border. ISIS, Islamic State, is on both sides of the border, and Jordan also has close to 1 million Syrian refugees. That is on top of the Iraqi refugees from the earlier decades. So it's a huge challenge for all the neighbors, and the neighbors are involved. The one country that has taken several hundred wounded people for treatment in hospitals but doesn't have Syrian refugees, and the country that has been least involved inside Syria is Israel. This is a paradox. Our great enemy in the past, a neighboring state. Everybody knows that it's very important for every state that there is no vacuum and anarchy on the other side of the border, so we are very attentive. But we have to try to keep away from that war. I'm not a supporter of the current Israeli government, but this is one compliment I will give the government, that the government and the Prime Minister have been very moderate and careful in not becoming involved in the Syrian civil war until now. But this could change in a matter of minutes. Hezbollah and Iran, now with Russian participation in the fighting, are compounding our life in Syria. ISIS could move from the area of the Iraqi border close to the ceasefire line with Israel, and from one day to the next we may find ourselves with a major Syrian problem on our hands. We find out that the Palestinian problem, which is our main domestic and foreign policy problem, is today less important in the Arab world and generally in the world. And for the Arabs, there are other problems. If you are a Saudi or a Kuwaiti or a Jordanian, you don't think morning, day and night about the Palestinian problem. You think about Iran, you think about Islamic State, you think about the stability of your own country. Yes, you care about the Palestinians, but in the order of priorities, it is less important today than it was a decade ago. And the same thing for the world. The Europeans look at the Middle East. Look at the change in European perspective on the Middle East. Suddenly, when they discovered that hundreds and thousands of volunteers were going from Muslims, from West European countries to Syria, they realized correctly that eventually, when they finish the job in Syria and come back to Belgium, Netherlands, France, and so forth, what they will have would be hundreds and thousands of trained terrorists with experience. And one of their major important interests became, how do I deal with this issue of my citizens who are now fighting in Syria and Iraq and will come back to my country one day? So maybe I do want to collaborate a little bit with the Syrian regime that I detest on many grounds, but has the information that may be useful for me. The second phase is the immigrants, the refugees. If my country is flooded by thousands and dozens of thousands of refugees from Syria, I want this to end. And if the price is that Assad remains in power, let him remain in power, because I don't want these immigrants and refugees. So the European perspective on these issues has changed. And of course, when they think about the Middle East, for them, again, the problems is the Iranian nuclear, it is ISIS, and less so Israel. Final point is the Iranian nuclear. I said Israel has been at the forefront of the fight against the Iranian nuclear. And we, of course, you can say, why should you worry? Because you have second and third strike capability. There could be what is ironically called MAD. That is an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction. You could have a regime of deterrence with Iran. Well, what worked between Moscow and Washington through the decades of the Cold War may not necessarily work between the Ayatollahs in Tehran and the government in Jerusalem. This is not something I think we would like to have. Second, we know that if Iran gets the bomb, so will at least 3 other Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia, which rumors say has already a bomb on the shelf somewhere in Pakistan, Turkey and Egypt. They just would not allow themselves not to have it if Iran has it. So the Middle East would become a nuclear area. The whole regime of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, will collapse, and this is going to be very bad for the world. And finally, if Iran has too much fissile material available that can be given away to groups like Hezbollah, this could lead to what we call a dirty bomb, a bomb in a suitcase left somewhere without a return address. This is a scenario we don't really want to think about. So it was very important for us that the agreement was made. It is, of course, a very hotly debated issue. I belong to those who think that on the strict nuclear issue, it's a fairly good agreement. Say it stops the Iranian nuclear program, it sets it back for a few years. And in the intra-Israeli debate between opponents and supporters, the argument is made, suppose the Israeli Air Force had launched a raid against the Iranian nuclear a year or 2 years ago, and we would have set them back by maybe 2, by maybe 3 years at a terrible cost. This agreement sets it back by more. But there are problems. It's for 15 years. Who knows what will be in 15 years? Who knows whether the monitoring will be effective, and if it's not effective, will the President of the United States, whoever he or she is, 6 or 7 years from now, be ready to act, not like Obama's red line, if there is an infringement. And finally, Iran, this is strictly on the nuclear. Iran has not become a stabilizing force in the Middle East. It continues to nourish a lot of dissension and disaffection in parts of the Middle East. So we have to deal with Iran at this point as a non-status quo power in the Middle East, potentially a disruptive force. So, having said all of this, what is the bottom line? The bottom line does take us back to the Palestinian problem. I said before that it is less important now for the Middle East, for the world. It is not less important for Israel. Because, for one thing, there is a demographic issue. Say, if nothing happens in the next 15 or 20 years, there will be a Palestinian Arab majority west of the River Jordan. And there will be what we call a one-state solution. This is something we do not want, something that I think most Palestinians don't want, although you find a mood among the Palestinians saying, well, we are not in a hurry. We'll just wait it out. We have a long history, and we can just wait it out. But we have an interest in resolving the issue, or at least in consolidating the issue and making clear that there is a two-state solution, a nation-state called Israel, that is the nation-state of the Jewish people, with a significant Palestinian majority of 20%, but a nation-state of the Jewish people, and a Palestinian state that is the national state of the Palestinians. This is important for us, I believe. It is also important for our relations with the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the world. The world does not want to see ongoing Israeli occupation of the West Bank or the need to lay a siege to Gaza. And for Middle Eastern countries that I mentioned before, they are willing to collaborate with us to some extent, but full collaboration will not happen before this is taken off the agenda. I don't have a magic formula for solving the Palestinian problem now, and I am afraid that right now may not be the moment. And everything that I described about the region is not conducive to a resolution. The three main partners to an agreement, the Israeli government, the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, and the United States, that has played a major role in all Arab-Israeli peacemaking and needs to continue to do the same, all are not ready for this at this moment. And so the imperative is not to manage the conflict. This has become a code word for continuing the status quo, but for reviving a peace process and beginning to move back on the peace process in order to take the poison out of the system and to enable Israel to start to live as a normal country and to live in greater peace and normalcy with its neighbors and the rest of the world. Thank you very much.